Park Chung Hee, a visionary leader, authoritarian ruler. Part 1, The Early Life of Park Chung Hee, Humble Beginnings, Struggles, and Ambitions. Park Chung Hee was born on November 14, 1917, in the modest village of Sangmo-dong, located in Gumi, Korea, during a time when the nation was under the colonial rule of the Japanese Empire. His birthplace, a rural and impoverished community, reflected the challenging conditions that would shape his childhood and, in many ways, his personality. From these unassuming beginnings, Park would rise to become one of the most influential and polarizing leaders in Korean history. His life story is not only a tale of individual ambition and perseverance, but also a reflection of Korea's own struggles and transformations in the 20th century. A family of modest means, the Park clan's descent into poverty. The youngest of 5 brothers and 2 sisters, Park was born into the Goryeo Park clan, which once held aristocratic yangban status. His father, Pak Sng Bin, was said to inherit moderate family holdings and maintain his place within the traditional Korean upper class. However, the family's fortunes took a dramatic turn when his father participated in the Donghak Peasant Revolution of 1894 to 1895. This rebellion, which sought to address economic inequality and resist foreign influence, ultimately led to his father's ostracization from the clan. Consequently, the family was cast into poverty, a condition that would deeply influence Park's upbringing. By 1916, a year before Park's birth, his father had relocated to his wife's village, Sangmo-dong, where they were granted a small plot of land. Even this modest opportunity proved challenging for the family. According to accounts, Park's father was reluctant to engage in physical labor, possibly due to his pride and lingering attachment to his former yangban identity. Instead, he was often seen drinking or wandering aimlessly, leaving much of the household's responsibilities to Park's mother, Peek Nami. Park's mother, despite her advanced age and difficult circumstances, emerged as the backbone of the family. Her contemporaries remembered her as a woman of exceptional diligence and focus. She took on the dual roles of managing the household and farming their land, ensuring her children had a chance to survive despite the family's dire poverty. Her resilience and resourcefulness left a lasting impression on young Park, shaping his understanding of hard work and sacrifice. An uncertain arrival, the birth of Park Chung Hee. When Park's mother discovered she was pregnant with her youngest child at the age of 43, the news was met with apprehension rather than joy. The family's economic situation was already disastrous, and another mouth to feed seemed an insurmountable burden. According to later accounts, she attempted to terminate the pregnancy on multiple occasions. However, fate had other plans, and on a chilly autumn morning in November 1917, Park was born. Despite her initial reluctance, Park's mother developed a deep affection for her youngest son, often demonstrating tenderness and care toward him, even amid the family's unrelenting hardships. Park's early years were marked by severe economic deprivation. The family frequently lacked sufficient food, and their small plot of land yielded only meager harvests. Hunger was a constant presence in Park's childhood, leaving both physical and psychological scars. Yet, these challenges also instilled in him a sense of resilience and a determination to rise above his circumstances. A sickly childhood, early struggles with health and physical frailty. From a young age, Park's health was a source of concern for his family. His undernourished body often fell prey to illness, and his frailty earned him the description of being sickly among those who knew him. One particularly harrowing incident occurred when Park was only 2 years old. While playing near the family home, he accidentally crawled off a raised floor and fell into a smoldering fire pit. Though he was quickly rescued, the burns he sustained left permanent scars on his forearms. This event had a profound impact on Park's self-image. Throughout his life, he took great care to conceal his scars, habitually wearing long-sleeved shirts even in the heat of summer. Despite his physical vulnerabilities, Park exhibited an early determination to persevere. Friends and neighbors noted his stubbornness and competitive nature. Even as a child, he refused to back down from challenges, a trait that would later define his leadership style. Education as a pathway to hope, the beginnings of a lifelong pursuit, education became a beacon of hope for young Park, offering a potential escape from the cycle of poverty that entrapped his family. In 1927, at the age of 9, he enrolled at Gumi Elementary School. This marked a significant milestone, as he was only the second member of his family, after his older brother Chung Hee, to receive formal education. However, attending school was far from easy. The school was located 6 kilometers from his home, requiring Park to undertake a long and arduous walk each day. During the harsh Korean winters, the cold was relentless, and Park often arrived at school with frozen fingers and toes. In his memoirs, he later recalled the struggles of those years, describing how his lunch would freeze solid by the time he arrived at school, forcing him to eat it cold or go hungry. Hunger was a persistent obstacle during his school years. On many occasions, Park went without meals for days. Yet, these hardships did not deter him. On the contrary, they seemed to fuel his resolve. He was a diligent student, earning good grades despite the challenges he faced. His teachers recognized his potential and frequently appointed him as class leader. However, his strict enforcement of discipline occasionally alienated his peers, who found his methods overbearing. The influence of tradition and modernity. While Park's formal education provided him with the tools to navigate the modern world, he also received a traditional education through a local seodang, where he studied Confucian classics on Sundays. This dual exposure to traditional and modern learning shaped Park's worldview, giving him a unique perspective that combined respect for Korea's cultural heritage with an embrace of new ideas. Though his family did not practice Christianity, Park briefly attended a Presbyterian church during his elementary years. This experience, though short-lived, reflected his willingness to explore different ideologies and systems of belief. Historical inspirations. The formation of a young dreamer. As Park progressed through his studies, he developed a deep fascination with history. He became an avid reader, immersing himself in the stories of great leaders and strategists. Two figures, in particular, captured his imagination: Napoleon Bonaparte, the French military commander who rose to power through sheer determination and brilliance, and Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the revered Korean naval hero who defended the nation against Japanese invasions during the Indian War. Park's admiration for these figures was not merely academic, he saw in their stories a reflection of his own aspirations. Their examples inspired him to dream of greatness, even as his reality remained one of poverty and struggle. The seeds of leadership. Park's childhood experiences, his family's fall from grace, the relentless challenges of poverty, his struggles with health, and his pursuit of education, laid the foundation for his later ambitions. These formative years instilled in him a resilience and determination that would define his leadership. However, they also sowed the seeds of his authoritarian tendencies. The hardships he endured and the lessons he drew from his historical heroes led him to value order, discipline, and strength above all else. As he walked the 6 kilometers to school each day, hungry and shivering, Park could not have imagined that he would one day rise to lead a nation. Yet, even in those early years, the traits that would propel him to power were already beginning to take shape. Part 2, A Path of Persistence. Chung Hee's journey through education and early aspirations, continuing education amid hardships. By 1932, Chung Hee had proven himself a diligent and determined student despite his family's dire circumstances. His academic performance earned him a place at Taegu Normal School, a secondary institution focused on training elementary school teachers. Admission to this school was no small feat. It was one of only 3 such schools in Korea at the time, and the competition for entry was fierce, with over 1,000 applicants vying for limited spots. Among them, Park was ranked 50th, a testament to his intellectual capabilities and resolve. However, Park's admission was met with mixed emotions within his family. His mother, who had worked tirelessly to support his primary education, worried about the financial burden his continued studies would impose. The Great Depression had deepened the economic challenges in rural Korea, and Japanese colonial policies further exacerbated the situation by extracting agricultural resources from Korean farmers. For the Park family, even modest living expenses associated with Park's schooling were a significant strain. Despite these concerns, Park's enrollment at Taegu Normal School marked a turning point in his life. The school's curriculum was rigorous, with a strong emphasis on discipline and preparation for public service. Students were expected to adhere to strict schedules and participate in military-style drills, reflecting the militaristic ethos of Japanese colonial rule. For Park, this environment seemed both challenging and transformative. Adapting to the militaristic environment, at Taegu Normal School, Park began to display an affinity for discipline and structure, traits that would later define his leadership style. The school's regimen included regular physical training, military exercises, and academic rigor. Park embraced these aspects wholeheartedly, excelling in activities such as kendo, Japanese fencing, and trumpet playing. His enthusiasm for these pursuits caught the attention of Lieutenant Colonel Arakawa Keiichi, a Japanese officer overseeing the school's military training program. This mentorship would later prove pivotal in Park's journey toward a military career. However, not all aspects of Park's time at Taegu were marked by success. By 1935, his grades had begun to decline significantly. He ranked last among the 73 students in his class, a stark contrast to his earlier academic achievements. Biographers suggest that this downturn was primarily due to his family's worsening financial situation. Each term, Park missed the first several weeks of classes because his parents struggled to gather the money needed for his living expenses. These absences made it difficult for him to keep up with his studies, and his performance suffered as a result. Park's classmates, many of whom came from more affluent backgrounds, recalled that he often felt humiliated by his poverty. When they pooled their money to buy snacks or treats, Park would excuse himself, unwilling or unable to contribute. On one occasion, a classmate discovered Park in tears, overwhelmed by the realization that his family could not support him. These experiences left a lasting impact, deepening his resolve to succeed and escape the cycle of poverty. Personal relationships and emotional struggles. During his time at Taegu, Park experienced his first romantic relationship, a connection that would later become a source of tension and regret. In 1934, he began secretly dating Yi Chang-gok, a student at a nearby girls' school. Their relationship was discreet, as the social norms of the time did not favor such interactions among students. Despite their mutual affection, Park's father had different plans for his son. Unaware of Park's romance, he arranged a marriage between Park and another woman, Kim Ho-nam. The marriage, which took place in 1935, was a union of convenience rather than love. Kim was reportedly shocked by the extent of the Park family's poverty and avoided close interaction with her husband. The couple had a daughter, Park Jae-ok, but their relationship remained distant and strained. While Park returned to school to complete his studies, Kim stayed with his family in the village, further deepening the emotional divide between them. Park's relationship with his daughter, Jae-ok, was similarly complex. After his eventual rise to power, he attempted to reconcile with her, but their bond remained tenuous. Jae-ok later expressed regret over their estrangement, a poignant reminder of the personal sacrifices Park made in pursuit of his ambitions. The Second Sino-Japanese War and a shift in aspirations. In 1937, Park graduated from Taegu Normal School, ranking 69th out of 70 students. Despite his academic struggles, the completion of his education was a significant achievement, as it marked the beginning of his professional career. As part of his obligations, Park was required to teach for at least 2 years, and he was assigned to the Mungyang Public Normal School, located in a remote coal mining town. Teaching offered Park a steady income for the first time, allowing him to support his family and improve their living conditions. However, the isolation of Mungyang, coupled with the monotony of teaching, left Park feeling restless. He sought intellectual and emotional stimulation, often turning to alcohol as a means of coping with his loneliness. Despite these challenges, his students remembered him as a dedicated and caring teacher who went out of his way to help them overcome their own struggles with poverty. During this period, global events began to influence Park's outlook. The Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, and Japan's rapid military successes captured Park's imagination. He became increasingly interested in pursuing a military career, viewing it as a path to both personal fulfillment and national service. This shift in aspirations was reflected in a stage play he wrote for his students, titled The Korean Volunteer Soldiers Go to War. The play celebrated themes of patriotism and sacrifice, mirroring the sentiments propagated by the Japanese colonial government. A controversial blood oath and the path to the military, in 1938, Park took a bold step toward realizing his dream of joining the military. He applied to the Manchukuo Army Military Academy, a prestigious institution established to train officers for the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. However, at 23 years old, Park was 3 years over the maximum age limit for candidates. Undeterred, he wrote a passionate letter to the academy, accompanied by a blood oath pledging his loyalty and service until death. The dramatic gesture garnered attention, but his application was initially rejected. Park's persistence paid off when influential figures intervened on his behalf. Lieutenant Colonel Arikawa, who had mentored Park at Taegu, reportedly advocated for his acceptance. Another theory suggests that Park may have joined the Gando Special Force, a controversial unit tasked with suppressing Korean independence movements in northeast China. While the details of his acceptance remain unclear, what is certain is that Park's determination to achieve his goal overcame significant obstacles. In March 1939, Park's efforts were rewarded when he was admitted to the Manchukuo Army Military Academy. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would shape his identity and set the stage for his eventual rise to power. A new beginning, the Manchukuo Army Military Academy. Park's enrollment at the academy introduced him to a highly regimented environment characterized by intense physical training, academic rigor, and a strict hierarchy. The student body was diverse, comprising Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese cadets, each bringing their own cultural and political perspectives. Despite the tensions inherent in this setting, Park excelled, quickly establishing himself as one of the top students. His fluency in Japanese and prior exposure to military drills gave him a distinct advantage, allowing him to adapt seamlessly to the academy's demands. During this period, Park adopted the Japanese name Tokogi Masoro, a decision that has since been the subject of much debate. Critics have cited it as evidence of his collaboration with the Japanese colonial regime, while others argue that it was a pragmatic choice necessitated by the circumstances. Part 3, Park Chung Hee, Transformation into a Military Officer. Life at the Manchukuo Army Military Academy, a rigorous training ground. Park Chung Hee's admission to the Manchukuo Army Military Academy in 1939 marked a pivotal turning point in his life. The academy, located in Shinking, modern-day Changchun, the capital of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, was an elite institution designed to train officers for both the Manchukuo Imperial Army and the Japanese Kwantung Army. For Park, this was an opportunity to leave behind the hardships of his rural upbringing and embrace a disciplined and ambitious new way of life. The academy was known for its strict regimen and rigorous training. Cadets were subjected to intense physical drills, academic studies in military strategy and tactics, and an uncompromising culture of discipline. Park thrived in this environment, displaying a keen aptitude for military studies and an unwavering commitment to self-improvement. Despite initial skepticism from some of his peers and instructors due to his Korean heritage, Park quickly earned their respect through his hard work and adaptability. The multicultural environment and Park's adaptation. The Manchukuo Army Military Academy was a melting pot of ethnicities and cultures. The cadet corps was composed of Japanese, Chinese, and a small number of Koreans like Park. This diverse environment presented challenges, as ethnic tensions were often high, with Korean and Chinese cadets frequently feeling marginalized by their Japanese counterparts. Park, however, found ways to navigate these dynamics. Fluent in Japanese and possessing an already disciplined character from his time at Taegu Normal School, he excelled in the academy's hierarchical structure. His proficiency in military drills, ability to adapt to the Japanese culture of obedience and loyalty, and strong academic performance earned him recognition. By the time he graduated in 1942, Park was ranked among the top 5 students in his class, a remarkable achievement for a Korean cadet in an institution dominated by Japanese interests. Adopting a new identity, Tokogi Masao, during his time at the academy, Park adopted the Japanese name Tokogi Masao, a move that symbolized his assimilation into the Japanese military system. This decision has been the subject of intense scrutiny and controversy. Critics argue that it reflected a betrayal of his Korean identity and an acceptance of Japanese imperialist ideology. Supporters, however, contend that it was a pragmatic choice, one that allowed him to advance in a system that required absolute loyalty to Japan. Park's adoption of a Japanese name was not uncommon among Koreans seeking advancement under Japanese rule. The colonial government's policy of shikaime, creating family and given names, encouraged or compelled Koreans to adopt Japanese names as a sign of loyalty. For Park, this decision was likely driven by a combination of personal ambition and the desire to succeed in a highly competitive environment. Excelling as a cadet, discipline and ambition, Park's time at the Manchukuo Army Military Academy was characterized by his disciplined approach to training and his determination to excel. His daily routine involved early morning drills, intensive academic lectures, and physical endurance exercises. Cadets were also required to participate in practical military exercises, which included weapons training, tactical maneuvers, and mock battles. Park distinguished himself through his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to think strategically. His instructors noted his exceptional ability to grasp complex military theories and apply them in practice. Despite occasional clashes with fellow cadets, particularly over issues of ethnicity, Park maintained a reputation for being focused and professional. In addition to his academic and military achievements, Park became known for his leadership qualities. He was frequently assigned responsibilities that required him to mentor or supervise other cadets, a role he embraced with characteristic thoroughness. While some peers found him overly rigid, others admired his commitment to order and discipline. Graduation and early military assignments. Park graduated from the Manchukuo Army Military Academy in March 1942, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in the Manchukuo Imperial Army. His performance at the academy ensured that he was assigned to a prestigious apprenticeship with the Kwantung Army's 30th Infantry Regiment in Harbin. Here, he served as a liaison officer, a role that allowed him to gain practical experience in coordinating military operations and managing personnel. The Kwantung Army, which was one of Japan's most powerful military forces in East Asia, provided Park with exposure to advanced military strategies and organizational structures. This experience further honed his skills and deepened his understanding of military hierarchy and command. It also reinforced his belief in the importance of discipline, efficiency, and centralized authority, principles that would later shape his leadership as South Korea's president. Continuing education. The Japanese Military Academy, recognizing Park's potential, his superiors recommended him for further training at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy near Tokyo. This institution was one of the most prestigious military schools in the Japanese Empire, reserved for the most promising officers. Admission was highly selective, and Park's acceptance was a testament to his exceptional performance and the impression he had made on his instructors. At the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, Park deepened his knowledge of military tactics, logistics, and strategy. The curriculum emphasized the integration of theoretical and practical training, with cadets participating in simulated battles and field exercises. Park's time at the academy solidified his reputation as a capable and disciplined officer. It also provided him with a broader perspective on military operations, preparing him for the challenges he would face in the coming years. World War II and the final days of the Japanese Empire. As World War II intensified, Park was assigned to the Manchukuo Imperial Army's 8th Regiment, where he served as an aide-de-camp to a regimental commander. His duties included planning military operations, managing communications, and ensuring the regiment's readiness for combat. Although he was not directly involved in frontline battles, Park's role gave him valuable experience in the practical aspects of military leadership. By 1945, as Japan faced defeat, the situation in Manchukuo grew increasingly chaotic. The Soviet Union launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in the region, leading to the collapse of the Manchukuo government. Park, like many other officers, was caught in the turmoil of Japan's surrender and the subsequent dissolution of its puppet states. Return to Korea, a new chapter. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Park returned to Korea, which was now under the administration of the United States Army military government. His time in the Japanese military had provided him with valuable skills and experiences, but it also left him with a complicated legacy. As a former officer in the Manchukuo and Japanese armies, Park faced both suspicion and resentment from his fellow Koreans, many of whom viewed him as a collaborator. Despite these challenges, Park's military background positioned him as a potential leader in the emerging South Korean armed forces. The post-war period was marked by political and social upheaval, and Park's disciplined and strategic mindset would soon come to the forefront as Korea embarked on its journey toward independence and modernization. Part 4: The Return to Korea, Rebuilding and Rising Through the Ranks. Return to a divided homeland. In 1945, with Japan's surrender and the end of World War II, Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule. However, the joy of independence was short-lived. The Korean peninsula was quickly divided along the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces controlling the south. This division marked the beginning of a tense and volatile period in Korean history, as ideological conflicts between communism and capitalism began to polarize the nation. For Park Chung Hee, returning to a liberated but divided Korea was both an opportunity and a challenge. Having served as a military officer under the Japanese, Park faced significant suspicion and hostility from his compatriots. Many Koreans viewed former collaborators with deep distrust, and Park's association with the Manchukuo and Japanese armies placed him in a precarious position. Nevertheless, his military training and leadership skills made him an asset in the emerging South Korean armed forces, which were in desperate need of capable officers. Joining the South Korean Constabulary, in the aftermath of liberation, the United States Army military government in Korea established the South Korean Constabulary as a precursor to the country's formal military. Park, leveraging his extensive military background, managed to secure a position in this newly formed force. His fluency in Japanese and his knowledge of modern military tactics, acquired during his time in Manchukuo and Japan, proved invaluable in helping him navigate this transition. Despite his expertise, Park's past affiliations remained a point of contention. His superiors and colleagues were wary of his connections to the Japanese military, and his rise through the ranks was far from smooth. Nevertheless, Park's discipline, intelligence, and strategic thinking set him apart, allowing him to gradually rebuild his reputation. Allegations of communist ties. In 1948, Park's career faced a major setback when he was accused of leading a communist cell within the South Korean constabulary. At the time, South Korea was in the throes of political and ideological upheaval, with widespread fear of communist infiltration fueled by the growing influence of the Soviet-backed North Korean regime. Park's alleged ties to the Workers' Party of South Korea, a leftist organization, led to his arrest and a military trial. He was convicted and sentenced to death. While the specifics of these allegations remain unclear, many historians believe that Park's arrest was politically motivated, driven by rival factions within the South Korean military. His case attracted the attention of several high-ranking officers who saw potential in him despite the charges. Among these was Paik Sun-yup, a prominent military leader who advocated for Park's release. Under pressure from influential allies, President Syngman Rhee commuted Park's sentence, sparing his life but forcing him to resign from the constabulary. A period of exile and reflection. Following his release, Park was effectively exiled from active military service. He spent the next few years working as an unpaid civilian assistant to the military, a humiliating position for someone of his abilities and ambitions. During this period, Park had limited opportunities for advancement and was largely relegated to menial tasks. However, this time also allowed him to reflect on his past and plan for his future. Park's experiences during this period deepened his understanding of Korea's political and social challenges. He witnessed firsthand the inefficiencies and corruption that plagued the government and military, fueling his desire to bring about change. Despite his setbacks, he maintained contact with influential figures within the military, carefully positioning himself for a return to power. The outbreak of the Korean War. In June 1950, North Korea launched a full-scale invasion of the South, triggering the Korean War. The conflict, which would last 3 years, devastated the Korean peninsula and left millions dead or displaced. For Park, the war presented an opportunity to re-establish himself within the military. With the South Korean armed forces in desperate need of experienced officers, he was reinstated as a major and assigned to an artillery unit. Park's performance during the war was exemplary. He quickly rose through the ranks, earning promotions to lieutenant colonel in 1950 and colonel in 1951. As a colonel, he served as the deputy director of the Army Headquarters Intelligence Bureau, where he played a key role in gathering and analyzing information about enemy movements. Later, he transitioned to commanding artillery units, demonstrating exceptional leadership on the battlefield. By the end of the Korean War in 1953, Park had been promoted to brigadier general, solidifying his reputation as a capable and effective military leader. His experiences during the war further shaped his worldview, reinforcing his belief in the importance of discipline, organization, and a strong central authority. Rising through the military ranks, in the years following the Korean War, Park continued to ascend the military hierarchy. He received advanced training at Fort Sill in the United States, where he honed his knowledge of artillery and modern military tactics. Upon his return to Korea, he held several key positions, including head of the Army's artillery school and commander of the 5th and 7th Divisions. Park's rapid rise was driven not only by his skills but also by his ability to build alliances within the military. He cultivated relationships with younger officers, many of whom admired his disciplined approach and shared his dissatisfaction with the government's inefficiency. Among his closest allies was Kim Jong-pil, a member of the 8th class of the Korea Military Academy, who would later play a pivotal role in Park's ascent to power. By 1960, Park had become one of the most influential figures in the South Korean military. As Chief of Staff of the First Army and later as Deputy Commander of the Second Army, he wielded significant authority, overseeing the defense of key regions, including the capital, Seoul. However, his ambitions extended beyond the military. Disillusioned with the political leadership of the time, Park began to consider the possibility of direct intervention in the nation's governance. The political turmoil of the late 1950s, and early 1960s were a period of political instability in South Korea. President Syngman Rhee, who had ruled since the country's founding in 1948, faced growing opposition due to widespread corruption, authoritarianism, and economic mismanagement. In April 1960, mass protests led by students and opposition groups culminated in Rhee's resignation and exile, marking the end of the First Republic. In the aftermath of Rhee's departure, a new government was formed under President Yoon Po-sun and Prime Minister Chang Myon. However, the new administration struggled to address the nation's deep-seated problems. Political infighting, economic stagnation, and social unrest created an atmosphere of disillusionment and uncertainty. For Park and many of his colleagues in the military, the civilian government's inability to restore stability was a source of frustration and concern. Laying the foundations for a coup, as the political crisis deepened, Park began to actively organize a group of like-minded officers who shared his vision for a more disciplined and centralized government. This group, which would later form the core of the Military Revolutionary Committee, believed that the only way to address Korea's challenges was through direct military intervention. Park's leadership within this group was marked by meticulous planning and strategic thinking. He recognized the need to act decisively, knowing that any hesitation could result in failure. By early 1961, as rumors of his impending retirement from the military began to circulate, Park accelerated his preparations for a coup, determined to seize the moment and reshape Korea's future. Part 5, the May 16 coup, Park Chung-hee seizes power, the prelude to the coup, a nation in crisis. By 1961, South Korea was a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The government of President Yoon Po-sun and Prime Minister Chang Myon, which had come to power after the ousting of Syngman Rhee, struggled to govern effectively. Factional disputes within the ruling Democratic Party paralyzed decision-making, while rampant corruption and mismanagement eroded public trust. Protests by students, workers, and opposition groups filled the streets, demanding political reform, economic recovery, and social justice. South Korea's economy was in a dire state. Decades of colonial exploitation, war, and ineffective governance had left the nation impoverished and heavily dependent on foreign aid, primarily from the United States. Inflation was rising, unemployment was widespread, and rural areas were mired in deep poverty. Public security was also a growing concern, as law enforcement agencies, long dominated by Syngman Rhee's loyalists, struggled to maintain order. For Park Chung-hee, a major general and the deputy commander of the Second Army, the situation represented both a crisis and an opportunity. Park and a group of like-minded officers believed that the civilian government was incapable of addressing the nation's challenges. They viewed themselves as the only force capable of restoring stability, rooting out corruption, and charting a path toward modernization. It was in this context that the Military Revolutionary Committee, led by Park, began to take shape. The formation of the Military Revolutionary Committee. The Military Revolutionary Committee was a clandestine organization composed of mid-level and senior officers who shared Park's vision of a strong, centralized government. The group's members included individuals such as Kim Jong-pil, a young and ambitious officer who would later become the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA. And other key figures from the 8th class of the Korea Military Academy, which had formed a close-knit cohort during their training. Park's leadership of the committee was marked by careful planning and strategic foresight. He worked to build a coalition of officers across various branches of the armed forces, ensuring that the committee had the resources and personnel needed to execute a coup. Park also sought to secure the support, or at least the neutrality, of key figures in the military hierarchy, including the Army Chief of Staff, Chang Do-yong, whom he nominally positioned as the coup's leader to lend it legitimacy. As rumors of the committee's activities began to circulate, Park's superiors grew suspicious. In early 1961, plans were reportedly underway to force Park into retirement, a move that would have effectively neutralized him as a political force. Realizing that time was running out, Park and his allies decided to accelerate their plans. The execution of the May 16 coup. In the early hours of May 16, 1961, the Military Revolutionary Committee launched its coup. Soldiers loyal to the committee moved swiftly to seize control of key government buildings, military installations, and communication networks in Seoul and other major cities. The coup's leaders issued a proclamation over the radio, declaring that their actions were necessary to save the nation from corruption, chaos, and the threat of communist subversion. Park and his allies framed the coup as a patriotic act aimed at protecting South Korea's sovereignty and ensuring its survival. They appealed to the public's frustrations with the civilian government, portraying themselves as reformers who would eliminate corruption, restore order, and build a stronger nation. To lend credibility to their claims, the coup leaders emphasized their commitment to eventually returning power to a civilian government once stability had been achieved. The coup faced little resistance. Prime Minister Chang Myon resigned, and President Yoon Po-sun, though technically still in office, was effectively sidelined. The lack of significant opposition from civilian or military authorities was partly due to widespread disillusionment with the government and partly due to the committee's careful planning and coordination. The role of the United States, the response of the United States, South Korea's most important ally, was critical to the coup's success. Initially, American officials were wary of the military takeover, fearing that it could destabilize the region and embolden North Korea. However, Park and his allies moved quickly to reassure the United States of their commitment to anti-communism and close cooperation with American interests. In private communications with American diplomats and military leaders, Park emphasized that the coup was aimed at strengthening South Korea's ability to resist communist aggression and achieve economic self-sufficiency. His assurances, combined with the lack of viable alternatives, led the United States to adopt a cautious but ultimately supportive stance toward the new regime. The Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. Following the coup, the Military Revolutionary Committee reorganized itself into the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, a governing body composed of senior military officers. Park, initially serving as the council's vice chairman, quickly consolidated power and emerged as its de facto leader. He emphasized that the council's mission was to implement sweeping reforms aimed at stabilizing the nation and laying the groundwork for economic development. The Supreme Council's early policies focused on combating corruption, restoring public order, and addressing economic challenges. High-profile investigations and arrests targeted officials accused of embezzlement, bribery, and abuse of power. The council also implemented measures to improve tax collection, reduce inflation, and promote industrialization. At the same time, the council moved to suppress political dissent and tighten control over the media. Martial law remained in effect, and opposition parties were banned or heavily restricted. While these actions were justified as necessary for maintaining stability, they also marked the beginning of Park's authoritarian rule. Public reaction to the coup. The public's reaction to the coup was mixed. Many South Koreans, particularly those in rural areas and the working class, welcomed the military's promises of reform and stability. The civilian government's failures had left a deep sense of frustration, and the prospect of strong leadership offered a glimmer of hope. Park's emphasis on anti-corruption measures and economic development resonated with a population weary of political chaos and economic stagnation. However, not everyone supported the coup. Intellectuals, students, and members of the urban elite were wary of the military's intentions, fearing that the takeover would lead to the erosion of democratic institutions and civil liberties. These fears were not unfounded, as Park's subsequent actions would demonstrate. Park's ascendancy to power. In July 1961, just 2 months after the coup, Park took full control of the Supreme Council by ousting Chang Doo-yong, who had served as the nominal leader of the military government. Chang's removal marked the consolidation of Park's authority and his emergence as the most powerful figure in South Korea. Under Park's leadership, the Supreme Council implemented a series of ambitious reforms aimed at transforming South Korea's political, economic, and social landscape. These reforms laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Miracle on the Han River, South Korea's rapid economic transformation during the 1960s and 1970s. Promise of civilian rule. Despite his authoritarian tendencies, Park understood the importance of maintaining a facade of legitimacy. Under pressure from both domestic and international audiences, he pledged to restore civilian rule within 2 years. In 1963, he stepped down from his military position and ran for president as the candidate of the newly formed Democratic Republican Party. He narrowly defeated former President Yoon Po-sun in a contentious election, officially transitioning from military leader to civilian president. Part 6. The early years of Park Chung-hee's presidency, laying the foundation for economic transformation, transition from military rule to civilian leadership. In 1963, 2 years after the May 16 coup, Park Chung-hee officially transitioned from a military dictator to a civilian president. To maintain the appearance of legitimacy and address mounting international pressure, particularly from the United States, Park resigned from his military position and ran in the presidential election as the candidate of the Democratic Republican Party, DRP, a political organization he had established to consolidate his power. The election was fiercely contested, and Park narrowly defeated Yoon Po-sun, a prominent figure of the deposed civilian government, by a slim margin of 1.5%. Despite the narrow victory, Park's ascent to the presidency marked a critical turning point for South Korea. It signaled the beginning of an era of authoritarian yet transformative leadership that would define the nation's political and economic trajectory for nearly 2 decades. The challenges facing Park's administration were immense. South Korea remained one of the poorest countries in the world, with a per capita income of less than $100, widespread unemployment, and an economy heavily reliant on foreign aid. The vision for economic development. From the outset of his presidency, Park made it clear that economic development would be his administration's top priority. He envisioned transforming South Korea from an agrarian, war-torn society into a modern, industrialized nation. To achieve this, Park and his advisors drew inspiration from models of state-led economic development, including Japan's pre-war industrialization and the Soviet Union's 5-year plans. Park believed that a strong central authority was essential for implementing the sweeping changes required to achieve rapid growth. One of Park's first actions as president was to establish the Economic Planning Board, EPB, a powerful government agency tasked with coordinating economic policy, allocating resources, and overseeing major development projects. The EPB, staffed by technocrats and economists, became the driving force behind South Korea's ambitious economic reforms. The first 5-year plan, 1962 to 1966, in 1962, even before assuming the presidency, Park had launched South Korea's first 5-year plan for economic development. This plan focused on laying the groundwork for industrialization through investments in infrastructure, energy, and transportation. Key initiatives included the construction of highways, ports, and power plants, as well as the establishment of industrial zones to attract domestic and foreign investment. One of the most notable projects during this period was the development of the city of Ulsan as a special industrial hub. The government partnered with Hyundai, a fledgling company at the time, to build shipyards and manufacturing facilities in the region. This collaboration marked the beginning of South Korea's close relationship between the state and private enterprises, which would later give rise to the chaebols, large family-owned conglomerates such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. To finance these projects, Park's government relied heavily on foreign aid and loans, particularly from the United States and Japan. While this approach allowed South Korea to jump-start its economy, it also created significant debt and left the country vulnerable to external pressures. Nevertheless, the results were remarkable. By the end of the first 5-year plan, South Korea's economy had begun to grow at an unprecedented rate, earning it international recognition as an emerging industrial power. Normalization of relations with Japan. A significant but controversial milestone of Park's early presidency was the normalization of diplomatic relations with Japan in 1965. The Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea, signed by Park and Japanese Prime Minister Lee Sakusat, marked the first formal establishment of relations between the two nations since Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule. The treaty included reparations and economic assistance from Japan, totaling $800 million in grants, loans, and investments. Park viewed the agreement as a pragmatic step toward securing the financial resources needed for South Korea's development. However, the treaty sparked widespread protests and criticism from the Korean public, who accused Park of compromising national dignity for economic gain. Many Koreans, particularly survivors of Japanese colonial atrocities, felt that the reparations were insufficient and that the agreement failed to adequately address historical grievances. Despite the controversy, the normalization of relations with Japan proved to be a boon for South Korea's economy. Japanese investments and technology transfers played a crucial role in the country's industrialization, particularly in sectors such as steel, electronics, and automobiles. The Vietnam War, an economic and strategic opportunity. Another defining feature of Park's early presidency was South Korea's participation in the Vietnam War. At the request of the United States, Park sent approximately 320,000 South Korean troops to fight alongside American and South Vietnamese forces, making South Korea the second-largest foreign contributor to the war effort. This decision was driven by both strategic and economic considerations. On a strategic level, Park sought to strengthen South Korea's alliance with the United States, which remained a critical guarantor of the country's security against North Korean aggression. On an economic level, the war provided South Korea with substantial financial benefits. The United States paid for South Korean troop deployments, and the Korean government used these funds to finance industrial projects and strengthen its foreign exchange reserves. Additionally, South Korean companies secured lucrative contracts to provide goods and services for the war effort, further boosting the economy. While the Vietnam War was controversial, particularly due to allegations of human rights abuses by South Korean troops, it contributed significantly to South Korea's economic growth during the 1960s and 1970s. The war also enhanced South Korea's international standing, as it demonstrated the country's willingness to play an active role in global affairs. The miracle on the Han River begins. By the mid-1960s, the foundations of what would later be known as the miracle on the Han River were firmly in place. South Korea's economy was growing at an average annual rate of 8%, making it one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Industrial output was rising, exports were expanding, and living standards were gradually improving. Key industries such as textiles, steel, and shipbuilding began to emerge, laying the groundwork for South Korea's transformation into a global manufacturing powerhouse. However, this rapid growth came at a cost. Labor rights were often sacrificed in the name of development, with workers enduring long hours, low wages, and poor working conditions. The government's close relationship with the chaebols also created an uneven playing field, as smaller businesses struggled to compete. Nevertheless, Park's focus on economic growth resonated with many South Koreans, who saw it as a path toward national pride and independence. Challenges to Park's leadership. Despite his early successes, Park's presidency faced growing challenges. Opposition to his authoritarian style of governance began to mount, particularly among intellectuals, students, and political activists. The government's suppression of dissent and control over the media drew criticism both domestically and internationally. Moreover, while Park's economic policies were largely successful, they also exacerbated income inequality and created tensions between rural and urban populations. In the 1967 presidential election, Park was re-elected to a second term, defeating his longtime rival Yoon Po-sun by a more comfortable margin. However, this victory came with its own set of challenges. the constitution limited the president to 2 consecutive terms, and Park, now firmly entrenched in power, began to contemplate ways to extend his rule beyond the 1971 election. Part 7. The consolidation of power, Park Chung-hee's second term and the Yushin era, securing a second term amid growing opposition. The 1967 presidential election marked a critical moment in Park Chung-hee's political career. Having successfully completed his first term with significant achievements in economic development, Park sought re-election as the Democratic Republican Party's candidate. His opponent, once again, was Yoon Po-sun, the former president and a leading figure of the opposition Civil Rule Party. Although Park secured a more decisive victory this time, the election revealed the deepening divisions within South Korean society. Park's campaign focused on his record of economic progress, emphasizing the rapid industrialization and infrastructure projects that had begun to transform the country. However, his authoritarian methods and suppression of dissent alienated significant segments of the population, particularly students, intellectuals, and workers. Opposition to Park's rule became increasingly vocal, with protests and demonstrations challenging his policies and governance style. Despite these challenges, Park's re-election provided him with a mandate to continue his ambitious development agenda. However, the constitutional limit of 2 consecutive terms loomed large, forcing Park to consider how he might extend his rule beyond 1971. Amending the constitution for a third term, shortly after his re-election, Park and his allies in the Democratic Republican Party began pushing for constitutional amendments to allow him to run for a third term. This move was met with widespread criticism from opposition parties and civil society groups, who accused Park of undermining democratic principles for personal gain. Despite these objections, the amendments were passed in 1969, paving the way for Park to seek another term in office. The decision to amend the constitution marked a turning point in Park's presidency, signaling his willingness to prioritize political longevity over democratic norms. While his supporters framed the move as necessary for maintaining stability and continuity, critics viewed it as a blatant power grab that set a dangerous precedent for future leaders. The 1971 presidential election, a narrow victory. The 1971 presidential election was one of the most contentious in South Korean history. Park faced a formidable challenger in Kim Dae-jung, a charismatic opposition leader from the New Democratic Party. Kim's campaign galvanized widespread support, particularly among younger voters and urban populations, who were disillusioned with Park's authoritarian rule. Despite the formidable opposition, Park managed to secure a narrow victory, winning 53% of the vote compared to Kim's 45%. However, the close margin highlighted the growing dissatisfaction with Park's leadership and the deepening polarization within South Korean society. The election also revealed the limits of Park's popularity. While his economic policies had brought significant progress, they had also created social tensions and exacerbated inequality. Workers, farmers, and students increasingly felt marginalized by the government's focus on industrialization and its close ties to the chaebols. The Yushin Constitution, Park's self-coup, faced with mounting opposition and a weakening mandate, Park took a drastic step in 1972 to consolidate his power. Declaring martial law, he dissolved the National Assembly, suspended the existing constitution, and implemented the Yushin Constitution. The name Yushin, meaning revitalization or renewal, symbolized Park's vision of a Korean-style democracy centered around strong, centralized leadership. The Yushin Constitution granted Park sweeping powers, effectively transforming him into a dictator. Key provisions included unlimited re-election. The president was allowed to serve an unlimited number of 6-year terms, effectively removing any constitutional barriers to Park's continued rule. Electoral college. The president was no longer directly elected by the people but instead chosen by a national conference for unification, a body controlled by Park and his allies. Rule by decree. Park could issue emergency decrees that had the force of law, bypassing legislative oversight. Suspension of freedoms. The Constitution significantly curtailed civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. The implementation of the Yushin Constitution marked the beginning of the Fourth Republic and the most authoritarian phase of Park's presidency. While Park justified the changes as necessary for national stability and economic development, critics condemned them as a betrayal of democratic ideals. Repression and control. Under the Yushin system, Park's government intensified its suppression of political dissent and opposition. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, already a powerful tool of state control, was granted even greater authority to monitor and suppress anti-government activities. Political opponents were frequently arrested, imprisoned, and tortured, while student protests and labor strikes were met with brutal crackdowns. The government also tightened its control over the media, ensuring that newspapers, radio, and television stations adhered to strict censorship guidelines. Cultural expression was similarly restricted, with artists, writers, and filmmakers facing severe consequences if their work was deemed subversive. Despite these repressive measures, resistance to Park's rule continued to grow. Underground movements, student organizations, and labor unions became increasingly active, challenging the government's policies and advocating for democratic reforms. These efforts were often met with harsh reprisals, but they laid the groundwork for the pro-democracy movement of the 1980s. Economic achievements and the costs of growth. While the Yushin era was marked by political repression, it was also a period of extraordinary economic growth. Park's government launched a series of ambitious development projects aimed at transforming South Korea into a global industrial power. These included the Heavy and Chemical Industries Drive, a program to develop industries such as steel, shipbuilding, petrochemicals, and electronics. The state-owned Pohang Iron and Steel Company, POSCO, was established during this time, becoming a cornerstone of South Korea's industrialization. The Seoul-Busan Expressway, completed in 1970, this highway became a vital artery for the country's transportation network and a symbol of modernization. Export-oriented policies. The government prioritized export growth, offering subsidies and incentives to companies that met ambitious production targets. This approach helped South Korea achieve a dramatic increase in trade and foreign exchange earnings. These policies yielded impressive results. By the mid-1970s, South Korea's economy was growing at an average annual rate of 10%, and its per capita income had risen significantly. The country became known as one of the Asian tigers, joining the ranks of rapidly industrializing economies such as Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. However, the rapid pace of industrialization came at a cost. Labor rights were frequently ignored, and workers faced harsh conditions in factories and construction sites. Environmental degradation and urban overcrowding became pressing issues, and the government's close ties to the chaebols fueled concerns about inequality and corruption. Park's paradoxical legacy. The Yushin era encapsulates the paradox of Park Chung-hee's rule, a leader who achieved remarkable economic progress while presiding over one of the most repressive regimes in South Korean history. Park's focus on modernization and development transformed South Korea into a global economic power, but his authoritarian methods and disregard for civil liberties left a lasting impact on the nation's political culture. As the 1970s progressed, cracks began to appear in Park's carefully constructed system of control. The global oil crisis of 1973 created economic challenges that tested the resilience of South Korea's export-driven model, while growing discontent among students, workers, and intellectuals signaled that the era of unquestioned authoritarianism was nearing its end. Part 8. The height of Park Chung-hee's authoritarian rule, repression, resistance, and the limits of power, the Yushin era in full force. The implementation of the Yushin Constitution in 1972 heralded the most authoritarian phase of Park Chung-hee's presidency. It granted him virtually unchecked power and marked the institutionalization of his dictatorship. Under this system, Park ruled South Korea with an iron fist, justifying his measures as necessary for maintaining national security and fostering economic development. However, these justifications did little to mitigate growing dissatisfaction among various segments of the population. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, already a powerful tool for surveillance and suppression, became even more central to Park's governance. It monitored political dissidents, suppressed anti-government activities, and maintained a climate of fear. Dissent was not only discouraged but also criminalized. Political opponents, labor activists, and student leaders faced harassment, imprisonment, and, in extreme cases, torture or execution. The state's reach extended to cultural and intellectual spheres as well. Writers, filmmakers, and artists were closely monitored, and their work was censored if it contained any hint of subversion or criticism of the regime. The government sought to control not only the political narrative but also the cultural identity of the nation. Cracks in the system, opposition movements. Despite the pervasive repression, opposition to Park's regime persisted and gradually intensified. Students, intellectuals, and labor unions became increasingly vocal in their criticism of the government, often organizing clandestine meetings and demonstrations. Underground publications circulated critiques of the Yushin system and called for democratic reforms. One of the most significant resistance movements of this era was the student-led protests. Universities became hotbeds of dissent, with students organizing rallies to demand political freedoms and denounce the government's authoritarianism. These protests were often met with brutal crackdowns, but they continued to grow in scale and intensity. In addition to student activism, labor unrest also posed a challenge to Park's regime. The rapid industrialization of the 1960s and 1970s had created a growing working class, many of whom labored under harsh conditions for low wages. Strikes and demonstrations by factory workers became increasingly common as they demanded better pay, improved working conditions, and greater rights. The assassination attempt and personal tragedy. On August 15, 1974, during a ceremony to mark the 29th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese rule, an assassination attempt on Park's life dramatically underscored the growing discontent with his leadership. A Japanese-born Korean sympathizer of North Korea, Mun Seg-wang, fired a gun toward Park as he delivered a speech. Although Park was unharmed, a stray bullet struck his wife, Yuk Young-soo, fatally wounding her. She died later that day, leaving Park devastated. The assassination attempt highlighted the extent of domestic and international tension surrounding Park's regime. It also marked a turning point in his personal life. Park reportedly became more isolated and emotionally detached following his wife's death. This personal tragedy, coupled with mounting political challenges, deepened his reliance on the KCIA and other repressive measures to maintain control. Economic challenges and resilience. While Park's economic policies had brought unprecedented growth, the global oil crisis of 1973 posed significant challenges. The sudden spike in oil prices disrupted South Korea's export-driven economy, leading to inflation and a slowdown in growth. These economic difficulties compounded public dissatisfaction with the government, as rising prices and unemployment eroded living standards for many Koreans. Despite these setbacks, Park's administration implemented measures to stabilize the economy and maintain momentum. The government prioritized energy efficiency and diversification, investing in alternative energy sources and promoting industries less reliant on oil. These efforts helped South Korea weather the crisis better than many other nations, but the economic strain further exposed the limits of Park's developmental model. Growing isolation and desperation. As the 1970s progressed, Park's isolation from the public and even his inner circle became more pronounced. Critics accused him of becoming increasingly paranoid and detached, relying on a shrinking circle of loyalists to govern. His use of emergency decrees and crackdowns on dissent suggested a leader more concerned with maintaining power than addressing the underlying causes of unrest. By 1978, Park's grip on power began to show signs of weakening. In the legislative elections that year, the opposition New Democratic Party, NDP, led by Kim Young-sam, won a significant share of the popular vote. Although Park's Democratic Republican Party retained a majority through the Yushin electoral system, the results reflected a growing dissatisfaction with his rule. The Busan Mason Uprising, in 1979, opposition to Park's regime reached a boiling point with the Busan Mason Uprising, a series of large-scale protests that erupted in the cities of Busan and Mason. Sparked by widespread anger over political repression and economic inequality, the demonstrations drew tens of thousands of participants, including students, workers, and ordinary citizens. Protesters clashed with riot police, and the unrest quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion against the Yushin system. Park's government responded with martial law, deploying troops to suppress the uprising. Hundreds of protesters were arrested, and many were injured or killed in the ensuing violence. While the uprising was eventually quelled, it exposed the fragility of Park's regime and the depth of public anger toward his leadership. The final months, internal tensions, as protests and dissent intensified, divisions within Park's inner circle began to emerge. Tensions between Park and his longtime ally Kim Jae-gyu, the director of the KCIA, became particularly pronounced. Kim, who had once been one of Park's closest confidants, reportedly grew disillusioned with the president's increasingly autocratic methods and the influence of Cha Ji-chul, the head of the Presidential Security Service. These internal conflicts came to a head on October 26, 1979, when Kim Jae-gyu assassinated Park during a dinner at a safe house in Seoul. The motivations behind the assassination remain a subject of debate. Some accounts suggest that Kim acted out of frustration with Park's refusal to implement reforms, while others argue that the act was a spontaneous decision fueled by personal grievances. Legacy of the Yushin era. The Yushin era left a complex and contested legacy. On one hand, it was a period of extraordinary economic progress that laid the foundation for South Korea's emergence as a global industrial power. On the other hand, it was marked by severe political repression, human rights abuses, and the erosion of democratic institutions. Park's authoritarian methods and the political instability of his final years created a deep-seated mistrust of centralized power that would influence South Korea's subsequent democratization efforts. The Yushin system, with its emphasis on control and order, was ultimately dismantled in the wake of Park's assassination, paving the way for a new chapter in the nation's history. Part 9, The Assassination of Park Chung Hee, a turning point in South Korea's history, the final days of Park Chung Hee's rule. By the autumn of 1979, South Korea was a nation on the edge. Economic hardships, political repression, and rising discontent among the populace created a volatile environment. Park Chung-hee's government faced increasing opposition from students, workers, and intellectuals, as well as growing dissent within the ruling elite. The Busan Mason uprising earlier that year had revealed the depth of public anger, while tensions between Park's allies signaled cracks in his regime. For Park, the challenges to his authority were not just external but also internal. His relationship with Kim Jae-gyu, the director of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, had become strained. Kim was once a trusted confidant, but he reportedly grew frustrated with Park's refusal to address the grievances of the people and his reliance on Cha Ji-chul, the head of the Presidential Security Service. Cha's influence over Park and his aggressive security measures alienated many within the government, including Kim. October 26, 1979, the assassination. On the evening of October 26, 1979, Park Chung-hee attended a private dinner at a KCIA safe house in the Gangjeong-dong area of Seoul. The gathering was intended to be a relaxed affair, attended by Park, Kim Jae-gyu, Cha Ji-chul, and a few other senior officials. However, tensions between Kim and CHA were palpable from the start. Kim reportedly resented CHA's overbearing manner and his control over Park's security arrangements. As the dinner progressed, an argument erupted between Kim and CHA. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as tense and confrontational. At some point during the altercation, Kim Jae-ju stood up, drew a revolver, and shot CHA Ji-chul. In the ensuing chaos, Kim turned the weapon on Park, firing multiple shots. Park was struck in the head and chest, killing him instantly. After the shooting, Kim and his accomplices attempted to flee the scene but were quickly apprehended by soldiers under the command of South Korea's Army Chief of Staff. The assassination sent shockwaves through the country, plunging the government into crisis and raising questions about the motivations behind Kim's actions. Motivations behind the assassination. The reasons behind Kim Jae-ju's decision to assassinate Park Chung-hee remain a subject of intense debate among historians and political analysts. Kim himself claimed that he acted out of patriotism, believing that Park's continued rule was a threat to South Korea's democracy and stability. He argued that the assassination was necessary to end the repression of the Yushin era and pave the way for democratic reforms. However, other accounts suggest that the act was driven by personal grievances rather than ideological principles. Kim's rivalry with CHA Ji-chul, who had effectively sidelined him in Park's inner circle, may have been a significant factor. Some have speculated that the assassination was a spontaneous act of passion rather than a premeditated political coup. Regardless of Kim's motivations, the assassination marked the abrupt end of Park's 18-year rule and set off a chain of events that would reshape South Korea's political landscape. Immediate aftermath and martial law. Following Park's assassination, South Korea entered a period of political and social turmoil. Prime Minister Choi Kyu-ha was named acting president in accordance with the Yushin constitution, but his authority was limited, and he struggled to assert control over the government. To prevent further unrest, the military declared martial law, imposing curfews, restricting civil liberties, and deploying troops to maintain order. The power vacuum created by Park's death also sparked a struggle for dominance within the military and political establishment. Major General Chun Do-hwan, then the head of the Defense Security Command, quickly emerged as a key figure. Chun took charge of the investigation into the assassination, using the opportunity to consolidate his influence over the armed forces and the KCIA. The trial of Kim Jae-ju and his accomplices were arrested shortly after the assassination and charged with treason and murder. The trial, which was held under heavy security, attracted widespread public attention. Kim defended his actions as an act of conscience, arguing that he had killed Park to save the nation from dictatorship. However, the court rejected his claims, sentencing him and several co-conspirators to death. Kim's execution on May 24, 1980, closed one chapter in South Korea's history but left many questions unanswered. Was the assassination a calculated move to trigger political reform, or was it a desperate act of defiance against a corrupt and authoritarian system? These questions continue to fuel debates about the legacy of Park Chung-hee and the events of October 26, 1979. The end of an era. Park's assassination marked the end of one of the most transformative yet controversial periods in South Korean history. His leadership had brought rapid economic growth, industrialization, and modernization, earning South Korea a place among the Asian tigers. However, his authoritarian rule, suppression of dissent, and disregard for civil liberties left a legacy of political polarization and unresolved grievances. In the months following Park's death, South Korea experienced significant political instability. The brief presidency of Choi Kyu-ha was overshadowed by the rise of Chun Do-hwan, who orchestrated a military coup in December 1979 and established another authoritarian regime. It would take nearly a decade of struggle before South Korea transitioned to a fully democratic government with the June democratic struggle of 1987. Park's funeral and legacy. Park Chung-hee's state funeral on November 3, 1979, was a somber and elaborate affair, attended by thousands of mourners and dignitaries. His burial at the National Cemetery in Seoul symbolized his stature as a pivotal figure in South Korea's history. However, the mourning was accompanied by mixed emotions, as many South Koreans grappled with the duality of his legacy. For his supporters, Park was a visionary leader who laid the foundation for South Korea's economic success. For his detractors, he was a repressive dictator whose methods undermined democratic principles and human rights. This dichotomy continues to shape public discourse about Park's impact on South Korea's development and identity. Part 10. The legacy of Park Chung-hee, a contested figure in South Korea's history, the dichotomy of Park Chung-hee's rule. Park Chung-hee remains one of the most polarizing figures in South Korean history. His leadership, which spanned 18 years, left an indelible mark on the nation, shaping its economic and political trajectory in profound ways. For many South Koreans, Park is remembered as the architect of the Miracle on the Han River, a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth that transformed South Korea from a war-torn, agrarian society into a global economic powerhouse. For others, he is remembered as an authoritarian ruler whose suppression of political freedoms and human rights cast a long shadow over his accomplishments. This duality is central to the ongoing debate about Park's legacy. On the one hand, his policies laid the foundation for South Korea's modern economy, enabling the country to compete on the global stage. On the other hand, his methods, which included censorship, surveillance, and the brutal suppression of dissent, undermined democratic values and left scars on the nation's political culture. Economic transformation. The Miracle on the Han River. Park's most enduring legacy is his role in spearheading South Korea's economic transformation. When he assumed power in 1961, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, with a per capita income of less than $100. By the time of his death in 1979, the country's economy had grown dramatically, with significant improvements in industrial output, infrastructure, and living standards. Key components of Park's economic policies included export-oriented industrialization. Park's administration prioritized the growth of export industries, offering subsidies and incentives to companies that achieved high production and export targets. This strategy helped South Korea build a competitive manufacturing base, particularly in sectors such as textiles, steel, and shipbuilding. The development of chaebols. Park fostered the growth of chaebols, large family-owned conglomerates that became the driving force behind South Korea's industrialization. Companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG thrived under his policies, benefiting from government loans, tax breaks, and strategic partnerships. Infrastructure projects. Park oversaw the construction of major infrastructure projects, including the Seoul-Busan Expressway and the establishment of industrial zones in cities like Ulsan. These projects improved connectivity, boosted economic efficiency, and symbolized South Korea's modernization. Education and workforce development. Recognizing the importance of human capital, Park's government invested heavily in education and vocational training. This emphasis on skill development enabled South Korea to build a highly educated and productive workforce. The results of these policies were remarkable. Between 1961 and 1979, South Korea's economy grew at an average annual rate of 10%, and its per capita income increased more than fivefold. This rapid development earned the country international recognition and positioned it as a model for other developing nations. The cost of economic growth. While Park's economic achievements are widely acknowledged, they came at a significant cost. His administration prioritized growth over labor rights, resulting in harsh working conditions for many South Korean workers. Long hours, low wages, and poor workplace safety were common, particularly in the early stages of industrialization. Strikes and labor protests were often met with repression, as the government sought to maintain stability and protect its alliances with the chaebols. The rapid pace of industrialization also exacerbated income inequality and regional disparities. While urban centers like Seoul and Busan benefited from economic growth, rural areas often lagged behind, leading to social tensions and migration to cities. Environmental degradation was another consequence of Park's development policies, as industrial expansion took precedence over ecological sustainability. Authoritarian rule and repression. Park's authoritarian governance remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. Under the Yushin Constitution, he wielded near absolute power, using the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, to monitor and suppress dissent. Political opponents, labor activists, and student leaders were frequently arrested, tortured, or silenced. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press was severely curtailed, creating a climate of fear and mistrust. The government's control extended to cultural and intellectual life as well. Writers, artists, and filmmakers were subject to censorship, and their work had to align with the regime's vision of national progress. While these measures were framed as necessary for maintaining order and unity, they also stifled creativity and innovation. Public perception, a divided legacy. Public opinion on Park Chung-hee remains deeply divided, reflecting the complexity of his legacy. Among older generations, particularly those who lived through the economic hardships of the 1950s and 1960s, Park is often regarded as a hero who lifted South Korea out of poverty and set it on a path to prosperity. For these individuals, his authoritarian methods are seen as a necessary trade-off for achieving national progress. Younger generations, however, tend to view Park more critically, emphasizing the human rights abuses and political repression that characterized his rule. For many, his authoritarianism represents a dark chapter in South Korea's history, one that undermined democratic principles and left lasting scars on the nation's political system. Family legacy and controversies. Park's family has also played a significant role in shaping perceptions of his legacy. His daughter, Park Geun-hye, served as South Korea's 11th president from 2013 to 2017. Her presidency was marked by controversy, culminating in her impeachment and removal from office over a corruption scandal. While Park Geun-hye's rise to power highlighted the enduring influence of her father's legacy, her downfall further polarized public opinion about the Park family. Gallup Korea and historical evaluations. A 2021 Gallup Korea poll ranked Park Chung-hee as one of South Korea's most highly rated presidents, alongside Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. This ranking underscores the enduring admiration for Park's economic achievements, particularly among older South Koreans and conservatives. However, it also reflects the ongoing debate about his authoritarian methods and their impact on the nation. The long shadow of Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee's legacy continues to shape South Korea's identity and politics. His vision of modernization, discipline, and national pride remains influential, as does his model of state-led economic development. At the same time, the authoritarianism and repression of his rule serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrated power and the suppression of democratic values. For South Korea, Park's legacy is both a source of pride and a reminder of the sacrifices and struggles that accompanied its rise to prominence. As the nation continues to grapple with questions of equity, justice, and governance, the lessons of Park Chung-hee's era remain relevant and instructive. Part 11. Park Chung-hee's influence on modern South Korea, continuity and controversy, economic influence, the framework of modern prosperity. Park Chung-hee's tenure fundamentally reshaped South Korea's economy, laying the foundation for the nation's transformation into one of the world's leading industrial powers. The policies he implemented during the 1960s and 1970s continue to influence South Korea's economic structure and priorities to this day. Many of the strategies and institutions he introduced, such as the chaebol-centered development model and state-led economic planning, remain cornerstones of the country's economic system. One of Park's most lasting contributions was the establishment of the Economic Planning Board, EPB, This powerful agency coordinated industrial policy, infrastructure projects, and foreign investment, creating a centralized approach to economic management. While the EPB no longer exists in its original form, its legacy can be seen in South Korea's ongoing emphasis on strategic planning and government-industry collaboration. The chaebols that flourished under Park's rule have grown into global conglomerates, dominating industries such as electronics, automobiles, and shipbuilding. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG owe much of their early success to the preferential treatment and subsidies they received during Park's presidency. While these conglomerates have driven South Korea's economic success, they have also been criticized for fostering inequality, stifling competition, and wielding disproportionate influence over politics and society. Political legacy: the transition to democracy. Although Park Chung-hee's rule was characterized by authoritarianism, his leadership also set the stage for South Korea's eventual democratization. The economic stability and national pride he fostered created the conditions for a more confident and assertive civil society. By the 1980s, a new generation of South Koreans, inspired by the economic progress of the Park era, began to demand greater political freedoms and accountability. The protests and movements that culminated in the June democratic struggle of 1987 can be seen, in part, as a reaction to the excesses of Park's rule. The harsh measures of the Yushin Constitution, combined with the systemic repression of dissent, fueled the desire for change and galvanized opposition forces. While Park's immediate successors, such as Chun Doo-hwan, continued the authoritarian model, the momentum for democracy proved unstoppable. Cultural and social transformation: Park's vision for modernization extended beyond economics and politics to encompass South Korea's cultural and social identity. He sought to instill a sense of national pride and discipline, often invoking historical figures like Admiral Yi Sun-sin as symbols of resilience and patriotism. This emphasis on collective effort and self-reliance became a defining feature of South Korea's national ethos. Park's policies also transformed South Korea's education system, making it more accessible and aligned with the needs of a modern economy. Investments in primary and secondary education, as well as the establishment of vocational training programs, helped create a skilled workforce capable of supporting the country's industrial ambitions. Today, South Korea's highly educated population is one of its greatest assets, driving innovation and competitiveness in a globalized economy. However, Park's emphasis on modernization also had unintended consequences. The rapid pace of urbanization and industrialization disrupted traditional communities and ways of life, leading to social dislocation and a sense of cultural loss. Additionally, the government's strict control over cultural expression stifled creativity and left a legacy of mistrust between artists and the state. A polarizing legacy: Park Chung-hee's legacy remains deeply contested, reflecting the complexities of his rule and its impact on South Korea. For his supporters, Park is a hero who rescued the nation from poverty and set it on a path to prosperity. They view his authoritarian methods as a necessary means to achieve rapid progress in a challenging historical context. This perspective is particularly prevalent among older South Koreans and conservative political groups. For his detractors, Park is a symbol of repression and injustice. They argue that his disregard for democratic principles and human rights inflicted lasting harm on South Korea's political culture and social fabric. Critics also point to the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few chaebol families as evidence of the inequalities perpetuated by Park's policies. Comparisons with other leaders: Park Chung-hee is often compared to other transformative yet controversial leaders, such as Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew and China's Deng Xiaoping. Like these figures, Park emphasized economic development and state-led modernization while maintaining strict control over political life. However, the outcomes of their leadership vary, reflecting differences in historical context, governance styles, and national priorities. Park's approach to leadership was shaped by his background in the military and his experiences under Japanese colonial rule. His belief in discipline, hierarchy, and centralization influenced his policies and governance style, leaving a unique imprint on South Korea's development. While comparisons with other leaders highlight the shared challenges of modernization, Park's legacy remains distinctively Korean, shaped by the specific struggles and aspirations of his nation. Modern reflections on Park's legacy. In recent years, public discussions about Park Chung-hee have been shaped by broader debates about South Korea's identity and future. His legacy is invoked in debates about economic policy, governance, and national security, with supporters and critics alike drawing lessons from his era. The construction of memorials, museums, and public commemorations dedicated to Park reflects the enduring significance of his leadership. At the same time, controversies surrounding these initiatives underscore the divisions in public opinion. For many South Koreans, the question of how to remember Park is intertwined with larger issues of reconciliation, justice, and national pride. Park's impact on South Korea's global standing. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of Park's legacy is South Korea's transformation into a respected global power. During his presidency, Park laid the groundwork for South Korea's integration into the global economy, establishing trade partnerships, fostering technological innovation, and promoting cultural exchange. Today, South Korea is recognized as a leader in fields ranging from technology to entertainment, a testament to the vision and ambition that characterized Park's leadership. However, South Korea's global success also highlights the challenges of addressing the inequalities and injustices that emerged during the Park era. As the country continues to evolve, the lessons of his presidency remain a source of both inspiration and caution. Part 12. Park Chung-hee's legacy in modern South Korean politics and society, enduring influence on South Korean politics. Even decades after his assassination, Park Chung-hee's legacy continues to shape South Korea's political landscape. His presidency is often invoked in debates about leadership, economic policy, and governance. Politicians from across the ideological spectrum have drawn on his legacy to support their agendas, demonstrating the enduring relevance of his vision and policies. Conservative political parties in South Korea frequently cite Park as a symbol of strong leadership and national progress. They emphasize his role in transforming South Korea into a modern industrialized nation and highlight his commitment to national security and anti-communism. Park's achievements are often used to justify calls for decisive leadership and pragmatic governance in the face of contemporary challenges. Progressive politicians and activists, on the other hand, tend to focus on the darker aspects of Park's rule, such as his suppression of dissent, violations of human rights, and concentration of power. For them, Park's legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarianism and the need to uphold democratic principles. Park Geun-hye and the revival of controversies. Park Chung-hee's legacy took on renewed significance with the rise of his daughter, Park Geun-hye, who became South Korea's first female president in 2013. Her presidency sparked intense debate about the impact of her father's policies and governance style. Supporters framed her as a continuation of Park Chung-hee's legacy, hoping she would bring stability and economic progress to South Korea. Detractors, however, warned of the risks of repeating the authoritarian tendencies associated with her father's rule. Park Geun-hye's presidency ended in scandal and impeachment in 2017, further polarizing opinions about the Park family. The corruption charges that led to her removal from office also prompted renewed scrutiny of her father's ties to the chaebols and the concentration of economic power during his administration. The events of her presidency reinforced the complexity of Park Chung-hee's legacy, as they highlighted both the achievements and the controversies associated with his leadership. Park's legacy in South Korean identity. Park Chung-hee's vision of modernization and national pride remains deeply embedded in South Korea's identity. His emphasis on discipline, hard work, and self-reliance continues to resonate with many South Koreans, particularly those who experienced the hardships of the post-war years and witnessed the country's rapid development firsthand. At the same time, the authoritarian aspects of Park's rule have left a legacy of mistrust in centralized power and a strong emphasis on protecting democratic freedoms. The pro-democracy movements of the 1980s, which ultimately led to South Korea's transition to a fully democratic government, were shaped in opposition to the repressive measures of the Park era. This dual legacy is reflected in South Korea's political and cultural discourse. While many celebrate the progress achieved under Park's leadership, there is also a collective awareness of the sacrifices and struggles that accompanied that progress. This awareness has fostered a commitment to ensuring that South Korea's future development is guided by principles of equity, justice, and inclusivity. Economic lessons from the Park era. The economic policies implemented during Park Chung-hee's presidency remain a subject of study and debate among economists and policymakers. His approach to state-led industrialization and export-oriented growth is often cited as a model for developing nations seeking to emulate South Korea's success. However, there are also lessons to be learned from the limitations and challenges of Park's economic model. The concentration of economic power in the hands of a few chaebols, for example, has created issues of inequality, corruption, and reduced competition. These challenges continue to shape South Korea's economic landscape and inform efforts to promote greater fairness and diversification in the economy. The environmental impact of Park's rapid industrialization is another area of reflection. The emphasis on growth at all costs led to significant ecological damage, prompting contemporary policymakers to consider more sustainable approaches to development. Cultural and historical commemoration. The legacy of Park Chung-hee is commemorated in various ways across South Korea. Statues, museums, and memorials dedicated to his life and achievements serve as reminders of his pivotal role in the nation's history. These sites often attract both admirers and critics, reflecting the ongoing debate about his impact. For example, the Park Chung-hee Memorial Library in Seoul serves as a repository of documents, photographs, and artifacts related to his presidency. While the library highlights his contributions to South Korea's modernization, it also invites visitors to engage critically with his legacy and consider the broader context of his rule. At the same time, efforts to memorialize Park have occasionally sparked controversy. Critics argue that such commemorations risk glorifying an authoritarian leader and downplaying the suffering experienced during his regime. These debates underscore the complexity of Park's legacy and the challenges of reconciling different perspectives on his leadership. Park Chung-hee in popular culture. Park's life and presidency have been the subject of numerous books, films, and television dramas, reflecting the public's fascination with his story. These portrayals often explore the tension between his achievements and his authoritarian methods, providing a nuanced perspective on his legacy. For example, historical dramas set during the Park era frequently depict the struggles of ordinary Koreans navigating the challenges of rapid modernization and political repression. Such portrayals highlight the human dimension of Park's rule, offering insights into the lives of those who were both beneficiaries and victims of his policies. A lasting legacy. Park Chung-hee's influence on South Korea is undeniable. His leadership fundamentally transformed the nation, setting it on a path of rapid development and global prominence. At the same time, his authoritarian methods and the sacrifices demanded of the Korean people have left a complex and contested legacy. As South Korea continues to evolve, the lessons of Park's presidency remain relevant. His achievements serve as a reminder of what can be accomplished through vision and determination, while his failures underscore the importance of balancing progress with justice and human dignity. In this way, Park Chung-hee's legacy continues to shape the nation he helped build, offering both inspiration and caution for future generations.